I'm recording now. So this is my friend Tim, and our history at the moment, the most recent part of our history is that we just finished up a podcast called Consuming Jung, which was reading the first section of the book Man and His Symbols it's by Jung and several other people. And each chapter of that section, that section was written by Jung. We did a little podcast about that, so that'll be in the show notes if anyone wants to check that out. But yeah, I wanted to. So we just actually concluded that. We're about to upload the last episode. When actually, I think you know more on when we're going to actually put that up.
I'm recording the second to last one today, or uploading it rather, and then next week, if we've got the audio file edited, will be when the final episode is posted. Right. So as far as next week, that would be June 27th.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So that'll be our conclusionary episode, but we wanted to continue. And so I've started this whole community up, which I don't even know what the name is exactly. The Discord is called Platformed Dialogos. We do these calls every Saturday, which I think people who are watching this video will generally know, but I would maybe just like to explain to you, because I don't know if I've really talked to you much about it. And then, so as a response to concluding that short series of podcasts, you and I want to continue doing something, and so I invited you onto this now a video medium, essentially, of the same idea. Of course, our podcast was a lot more, well, not a lot more, but it was a bit more directed because we had text to focus on. So, yeah, and I guess, so we've talked about this before, but I would just like to ask you, for the benefit of the video, because we've said we've really valued just the process of making a podcast, even if nobody actually listened to it. So what has that been for you? Why is that the case for you?
It's just it's like the thing that we want out of life, beyond the normal stuff. You're filling in your time with something, and it's like having good conversation is way up there. Like, it's not blissful the way that a 12-year-old playing video games for the first time is, or other blissful activities you can do, like sex or drugs, but it sort of feels like a more sustainable version of satisfaction. And we all want to have good conversations, but it's surprising how little of that we tend to have. A lot of it is people waiting for their turn to talk and just kind of masquerading their ego around, which that's really hard to get away from. I mean, I'm sure we'll do it today to whatever extent, even though we're aware of it. But we, through over a decade of friendship and just having kind of a dedication, or being aware of what we want in terms of what we want out of our conversations, seem to be having really good ones. And recording that is a whole other element of it, in a way that's uncomfortable at first, but then adds to the fun. You're a lot more thoughtful and considerate and articulate, and it feels great. I'm sure there's more there, but how's that for an answer?
Yeah, that's good. It's the process of recording it, and at least for a theoretical audience, let's say, because I doubt we have too many viewers right now, or listeners, I should say. I mean, on one hand, it's a little. Well, I think what made you and I both nervous or maybe anxious about it at first is it's kind of you're presuming that you would have something to say that people want to listen to. We each presume that if we're going to get into a podcast together. But once you get past that, you're right. The value in recording something for even a theoretical audience means that you put more effort into it and more thought. and you end up being more articulate, and you just pay more attention too. So what we were doing is we were reading Jung, and then it's funny. It's almost like retroactively changes how you read the text. Because if I was just reading Jung on my own, I would maybe get it on my phone, and I would just read it, while I'm waiting for something else to happen, or maybe before bed. But because of this, I consistently actually printed out the papers and made notes on that, because I knew that I had an obligation. I think obligation is part of it too, or the routine of it. That every Saturday I would be expected to have something to say. It's not you or me exactly holding that expectation. It's us. It's like the shared obligation, which is interesting. And yeah, it pulls us forward into not just consuming something, but kind of producing something, which then means we're consuming it more fully, which leads to this payoff of even a self-centered gratification. Again, even if no one listens to it, we have consumed this book in a way more deep way. Or, well, I should say the section. We haven't read the rest of the book yet. So, yeah.
But I would still consider us experts on the topic after a couple of chapters.
Yeah.
I mean, that's ties it up into the whole thing. You can't help but feel pretentious no matter how seriously you take it. And as humbly as you approach it, there's something about saying, hey, I have a podcast for other people, that feels so uncomfortable that you never want to sell yourself, even to people you think might genuinely, be willing to bear your arrogance in trying to record something. It's a very self-defeating, and I think a lot of that is internal. Just again, the ego will represent or give you an infinite amount of reasons, endless, really compelling reasons not to put yourself out there. I mean, like rational too, but you just kind of have to be irrational, and that's some of the things we're learning from this book is the value of being irrational, which I never would have agreed with before we started. And it's because, I don't know if I would have agreed with it if we hadn't put so much effort into it. It would have been another book that I might have enjoyed in a cursory way, but being forced to talk about it in a way that's formal, in a way that's orderly, has made it one of the most important pieces of text I've ever read, and I think that's not because it actually is visionary, or at least it's visionary, but we have access to more visionary texts than we can even read, right?
Yeah.
We have all of human history and modern people who are so intelligent and wise. So there's lots of visionary books that I've read, and have felt that they were amazing. But this one in particular, having done work associated with it, it feels like it's on a new kind of level that I would like now all of those to be elevated as well, that future books to be elevated to that level, because the difference is huge. But there's an opportunity, of course. You still have to choose which books, because it wasn't a trivial time commitment. I think 3 to 4 hours minimum, probably longer, for us to record 30 minutes to an hour of audio. And I think your time commitment might have been even larger.
Yeah. And interesting thing that came up near the beginning of what you were saying was there was a specific example in the Jung text about this guy whose dreams, I don't remember the exact dreams, and maybe you can help me with this, but they seemed to be saying that he sort of secretly believed himself to be intelligent and wise, but he never actually spoke up to his friends unless they specifically asked him something, and then he would speak up. And Jung was saying, this guy, he was telling himself a story that he's really intelligent, but by not stepping out and actually saying things, he doesn't actually have to test that hypothesis. And the implication is he doesn't want to test it because it's scary, because what if it's wrong? And so, to get over the fear and yell out something, even if it's into the void, but say it boldly, like we're sort of doing with our podcast. I mean, the boldness is just in the action of publishing a podcast. And to do that, Yeah, I guess my point is that's the reason it's scary, is because you risk finding out in some way that that it I don't know, that all of your beliefs about your worth were somehow delusionary. That's what you contend with when you want to publish
Right.
something. And same with writing too. And you and I actually are both into writing as well. Maybe you more recently, but I would also say more passionately. So it's a similar thing.
Yeah. Well, it's just yeah, writing is a great way to realize you don't know anything. If
Uh-huh.
you write, you constantly contradict yourself. You hate what you're writing because you know it's wrong and you can't really articulate why it's wrong. You're so used to one particular lens, and as soon as you have to commit to it, you're like, wait, I don't know anything.
Yeah.
Shit.
Yeah.
And yeah, podcasting, it's less so, recording audio, you can sort of you're so focused, there's not as much self-reflection. You're sort of committed to being a good listener. And
Mm.
if you're articulating your thought or trying to just like form your intuition, then you're probably not listening, because
Mm.
that, I don't know that you can do both. You just have to let it happen in the background, in that sort of semi-conscious state where it's like when you're talking, at some point you'll say something and I'll have an idea of what I'll say, but I don't know what I'm going to say. I'll just know that something you said triggered an idea, and I just trust that once I start speaking, I'll clarify to a reasonable degree what I meant to say. And,
Mm.
and something about what you said earlier that I just want to get out is it just, we're kind of in the midst of chaos here. We're sort of nervous that won't be coherent, perhaps.
Mm.
We want it to go well, but we don't actually didn't really know exactly what we'd be talking about. We went over a vague list of maybe ideas that would be interesting to hit upon, but we didn't know exactly what we would say. And you have this kind of orderly agreement to, there's certain rules of engagement where we're recording this and we're willing to listen to each other. And there's other rules that we don't have to say, but that we both know and agree with. But it's at the same time, it's that chaos is what makes it interesting. If we
Mm.
knew exactly what we would say, we wouldn't even bother to record it.
Yeah. Right. And you actually couldn't. It strikes me as somehow impossible for us to, if we were to try to um, script something and have it generate the same content, we would just turn ourselves into bad actors. I'm not a good actor, as far as I know. I'm a pretty bad actor, and
Yeah.
so that would be such a pale comparison to what we're doing now, which is, I really like how you're pointing it out too. There's a sense in which I have no idea actually what we're really going to dig into next. And that's it's a little scary. It's exciting, but it's almost like it's the fuel that at least I feel I need to make the content I want to make. I mean, I'm sure there's other ways to make. I know that there's other ways to make content, but for me, um, both with how you and I make the podcast and then how I try to record videos with others, the more I can, let's say, be comfortable in that chaos and stay in there and stay engaged with the other person. If I have all those, it's almost like it's impossible to have a bad conversation somehow.
Well, you're interested in good conversations, and so I want to stick a knife into that, or at least stick a knife into this medium. Because, and I've criticized it to you before, but I'm
Mm.
going to do it on air, which
Okay.
is I don't like the video aspect. If I were to watch, if I were to consume a Joe Rogan podcast, I know he records them. I don't watch the recordings of the people's mouths moving. To
Mm.
me, that actually doesn't add anything. And some of the best conversations I've ever had have been with people walking. And I think it's even beyond just kind of getting exercise. I think it's that we're not looking at each other when we're walking. Like,
Mm.
you can maybe look over at someone, but I feel that being free of reading body language allows you to be so, you can frame the conversation a lot better. There's sort of less of, that's the surprising thing, is that more body language and more facial reading actually seems to make for less focused conversations. That's just what I've noticed. I mean, you seem to be really enjoying these video, and maybe they're different from in-person things. But I just feel like the best conversations I've ever had are audio only.
Right.
And so how does that, what's wrong with
Yeah.
that way of thinking?
Well,
Or how would you react?
yeah. Well, I mean, first, I want to say that these are all different mediums, and I think you'd be hard pressed to point out any medium that's either the best or the worst, or even rank them in any. It seems like an objective ranking of the different mediums, of which there are an infinite number. There's Zoom call, there's a Zoom call without video, there's Facebook Messenger versus WhatsApp, and then there's in person and all. So anyway, to rank those is so but I'm not going to cop out of the
Well,
question. I just want to say that
yeah.
first.
Let me just stop you right there and say, I think we can all agree that slam poetry is the highest form of communication.
That's right. Yeah. Well, yeah, of course,
Everything
other
else
than
is second
slam
place.
poetry, my point remains.
As
Yes.
an aside. Okay,
Yeah.
please continue.
Now that we've got that out of the way. Um, um, yeah. So one thing I want to point out is that there actually is nonverbal communication even when you're walking. So like, let's say we're walking and you say something and you notice I've completely stopped walking and you've walked forward a few steps. That actually indicates quite a bit. It indicates that like either whatever you said struck me so much that I'm like flabbergasted, or I'm like really pissed off. Like I'm so affected that I stopped walking. That's what that would mean, right? Um, our friend Liddy, sometimes we would walk on Creamer's Field a lot, and without being able to recall a specific memory, I would bet that if she is walking comparatively faster or slower, that's going to give me some idea of her, how she's feeling about the conversation. Well, I mean, think about it like this: you're walking. Let's say you're walking on a loop trail, and you know it's going to be about a 1 hour walk. If you're walking with somebody and they're really enjoying the conversation, it stands to reason that you would both just naturally slow down because you both, intuitively don't really want it to end. Whereas if it's a more frustrating conversation, you might find yourselves picking up speed. And so, um, yeah, so that's the one point. I guess that's that, and the fact that they're all just different mediums. That's the two things I feel like I can say confidently in response to what you say.
They're just different. Yeah, that's true. There's definitely, I like recording podcasts with you, but I don't always like talking with people on the phone. But then that's still better than kind of voice video calls where you're kind of seeing this face, I think that, that has more to do with not being there physically with the person. And maybe just being frustrated with that. But I just always notice that I don't like the video if I can help it. And I think there's something there that's true in a way that is kind of surprising to people, that the best content might have less, not more, kind of a minimalist idea. But best, right? That's sort of a suspicious word. I would agree that different mediums can offer different things. Like, it's great that we can interrupt each other and know something we can't do when we're doing audio only. We just can't see that look of needing the other person needing something, like maybe even gesturing in some way. So that does add a very useful tool. So I cannot argue that.
Right. Yeah, and that is definitely what's on my mind when I think about these videos versus audio. It's actually not really it's not about what the viewer sees or hears. And I wouldn't be surprised if people would maybe generally prefer to listen to all of my conversations without the video. I mean, for one thing, it's more convenient, right? You can drive in your car and listen to it.
Exactly.
But when you're producing it, I think it does add a lot more room for exactly what you just said, these nonverbal indications that would just produce, even in terms of audio, it would actually produce better audio because there's more of a organic flow to the speech. With our podcast, I think instead we just learned sort of, I don't want to say rules because it's not like we wrote them down, but we learned habits to allow ourselves room to speak. So we kind of developed skills to correct for that lack. And I
Right.
actually wonder, I wouldn't be surprised if people listening to this, if they're familiar with my channel, would notice a different cadence in how we're speaking, because we did build those skills. Just amusing on my
Maybe.
part. I don't know.
I've watched some of the videos. It does seem like there's very little interrupting except for the occasional joke, and that is so critical. Sometimes someone's making a long point and they need to make the full point because the half point is very weak. And
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, you can disagree with the half point, but if you heard the whole thing, then you would see the whole picture and be, reticent to make the point you were just going to make. You can make a more interesting point as a result. And that definitely has been consistent. But there's probably, would we expect any two people to communicate in the same way?
Hmm. Yeah.
Probably not.
Probably not. Yeah.
Especially with deeper friendships, like you just develop these sort of shared idiosyncrasies and
Hmm.
understandings that you wouldn't realize that you had them until someone pointed them out, if they could.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, how about, do you want to go in just a controversial direction?
Let's fucking do
Let's
it.
talk about something that fires us up and will get us fired from life or
Sure.
whatever. Um, you're not allowed to be who you are.
Oh man, I didn't want to be
Um,
fired from life.
it's coming. Hopefully not. There's always options, but you seem to be on, the frontiers in a lot of new things. Do you have any recommendations for where we could go?
In this conversation, or you mean like steering the whole fucking humanity into into
uh,
victory?
into the fist. um, no, in this conversation more so, but
Yeah. Um, yeah. So we could talk about. Well, yeah. I guess one thing I would like to uh, bring out is this idea of um, whether or not society-wide we're on the precipice of a significant shift. Um, it's an idea that I find a lot of validation in in certain groups. So the Dialogos community that I'm very involved in. It seems whenever I ask people, "Do you think that's what's happening?" and I really try to be neutral in the way I say what I think, and then I ask if they, what do you think? And they typically say yes. I would say even 80 or 90% of them. Now, the suspicion or the danger there is that that is a particular community, and that could be, you always have to worry about drinking the Kool-Aid, and just thinking that you have, well, maybe to be more specific, to speak more carefully, the danger is that you would take that signal to be more indicative of like a shared truth than it really is. Because the question I'm interested in, when I ask people whether they think we are on the precipice of a major cultural shift, the reason I ask that is because it's not exactly to verify whether it's true. It's more directly to verify whether the world at large believes it. So the danger, if I ask this question to a particular community and get a bunch of yeses, the danger would be then to think that that means everyone thinks that. So anyway, that's why I ask the question as much as I can, of course, is to kind of correct for that. I'm going to be naturally biased because I only have the particular friend network that I have. So to some degree, I'll never get away from that bias, which, by the way, I think will be a component of what I see changing about the world, is that we'll only be able to look out in the world as embedded in networks. We won't really be able to have a top-down view. That's just a thought that's been occurring to me. Anyway, so this idea of being on the precipice of a cultural shift, you shared your reaction to that privately with me, but rather than try to summarize it, I would just like you to respond, yeah, right now. How does that whole framing feel for you?
It's I think I would disagree, at least initially, or at least doesn't quite fit in with what I think I know about history, which is that history was far more interesting than what we're going through right now. We're talking about World War One. You have trench warfare, all that propaganda, and just meat machines, putting human lives through the grinder.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we had the Soviet Union, which thought that United States was led by Satan, and the United States thought the Soviet Union was led by Satan, and that only one could win, and it was very much good versus evil. And you're pointing nuclear missiles at each other, and they're very close, and you have ships moving, and it seems like it's possible for someone to press a button and destroy the world. Just pressing a button could destroy the world. And you have, the Romans, where for a time, hundreds of thousands of armed individuals could show up at your borders. You didn't know they existed until they showed up. Maybe you heard that they're coming, but you have times where people would just show up and decide that your land and your stuff and your freedom was theirs. And I see the intensity of that, and you can cherry pick, and maybe there is a couple hundred years where not too much happened in the dark ages or something like that. But there's clearly been incredible times that I don't feel like I'm in as much as those, which is not to say that I don't see that there's a lot of simmering things that are super important that could transform the way we live. I just don't see those transformations as fundamentally new, which is maybe not actually a disagreement with you, because I see transformation as possible. I don't actually feel like I'm on the precipice of it in a way that maybe you do. So how does the historical context, does that change the way you think about it, or can you incorporate it into your view?
Yeah, I could. So the way that it would fit into my worldview, this is an interesting thing though, trying to fit data points into your worldview. It's a very rationalist thing to do. And I've become more wary of it generally, like more aware of the fact that there is a part of me that if a data point comes in that doesn't fit into my worldview, it will just bounce off. And it's almost like I can become aware of it, but the mechanism that does that is almost out of my control, or at least something I can't get rid of. So anyway, with that little caveat, or alternatively, take the data point in and tweak it and almost lie about it in some sense so it fits in your worldview. But so anyway, with that caveat there, I would say, well, one question that comes up is, what is the scale of the shift that we or I am proposing? Because let me think here for a second. So it actually gets on this book I've been reading, Sovereign Individual, and his argument. Let me just say this, just to give more clarity to what I mean when I talk about a big cultural shift. And when I say this, by the way, to, let's say, the group that generally I get a lot of validation from, a lot of that validation actually turns into more of a, oh, really? You think that? Not totally against the idea, but they are surprised at the magnitude. So in the Sovereign Individual, he very much argues that we're at the end of a 500-year cycle. I don't really mean like a mystical cycle, like every 500 years it's destined or something like that. But he just makes the observation that if you look at the last 4 or maybe just 3 500-year periods, you have pretty distinct types of societies. And the last one of those was a shift from medieval chivalry lifestyle, where there was a lot of faith in the church, and the church kind of ran almost everything. And then that changed into industrialism. And that was a really significant shift. And then we don't need to get into this book too much, just because I know you haven't really read it, but he argues that's because of the mega political, what they call, it's actually 2 authors, what they call the mega political influences of, well, I guess I don't want to dive too deep into that, but they're arguing that there is something that you call megapolitics that kind of that will influence things. And they're saying that the megapolitics, due to the internet and information technology, has changed such that we're about to go through this new incredible shift. So yeah, I think I got off. I think I sort of ran away a little bit from where I wanted to go. But what I'm trying to say there is that's the scale that I, let's say, have bought into. That's what I bought into. I bought into that. Yeah, we're going through a really significant shift, such that the next 500 years will be like an entirely different kind of society than the previous 500 years. And then, yeah, again, to say again, I don't meet a lot of people who actually agree with that specifically, unless they've read this book. So a lot of my friends now are reading The Sovereign Individual, and seem to be pretty convinced by it, sold by its arguments. So does that context help?
I would need to understand more about what the changes are that they think are coming, but it's not like I feel like I'm not explaining my my context, my worldview well enough, because it while I'm saying that I don't know that this is a particularly interesting cultural transformation coming, at the very same time as like a form of doublethink, I see things like our quest for immortality, our meddling with our genome with CRISPR and being able to design, you know, our babies perhaps to have super geniuses, you know, our rapid advancement of technology, which might make us literal gods, you know, as beautiful as Aphrodite, as strong as Hercules.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of this maybe is colored by me reading Homo Deus by Yuval Noah Harari. So these ideas really are his, but I like them a lot, and they're quite recent. Quite recently, I have space in my head. So I have the sense that times will be different and that they'll change faster than they have in the past. So perhaps these cultural, I guess, and I feel like I'm actively contradicting myself now. I do sense that bigger events will happen as a result of our technological growth, which will actually go faster, that will sort of accelerate our cultural shifts to where we really can't even imagine we can't even imagine what kind of political and cultural system we have, because we might have minds that are different from our own. We might be melded with computers, or we might have super, you know, just kind of a new class of ultra beautiful, ultra wealthy, ultra wise um, people that may not even be Homo sapiens anymore. And how do you predict the mind you don't even understand? Like that just seems impossible. Like
Mm-hmm.
what kind of goals would appeal to it? And so I see the future as an unknown. I see these things that have never, um, that humanity has never dealt with. And at the same time, I see those things, I think, but what's really fundamentally different with that? Like,
Mm-hmm.
how is that different from the Spanish Inquisition, where suddenly religion and adherence to it sort of created the moral space to burn people of imaginary crimes like being witches? Like that's shockingly, you know, a psychologically fascinating thing. Is what we're talking about now more significant than that? Maybe you're not arguing that it's more significant, but at least we don't want to be going through World War II. We don't want to be going through Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah.
That alone is quite alarming. If you were to suggest that a historical event is on the precipice, historical events usually don't mean that there's going to be more pleasure for everybody. It usually means more suffering,
Hmm.
right? So I am open to that, but I feel like we're maybe still saying kind of different things.
I know I hear what you're saying, and so um, I would say before I started reading the Sovereign Individual, and also before I started following Rebel Wisdom, which that, by the way, is the common point for this Dialogos community that I am should suspect myself of drinking the Kool-Aid with, if I'm going to be very scrupulous. Um, but the shift, so I would say that before that, I would put things very similar to you, which is to say, well, okay, clearly technology is advancing, and even our wisdom is advancing in this exponential manner. So then things will keep changing faster than they've ever changed before. What's new to me now is quite a different story, I would say. Uh, and that story is that we are coming to the end of a particular configuration of society. And then what we're entering into is this liminal space, which I think you could very usefully describe as the hero's journey into the descent. And it's going to be fucking crazy, and no one will know what's going on, and it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And then we're going to come back out into a new stable configuration. Other people talk about, I think, the same thing as a phase shift. And this is coming sort of an amalgamation of several different ideas. The idea that we're on the precipice of a 500-year long, a change from a 500-year something to a who knows how long something else, that comes from the sovereign individual. The idea of a liminal space comes from rebel wisdom and their related thinkers. But anyway, I hope that clarifies more the thing that I see happening, and I'm becoming more convinced of it. And yet, again, I'm so interested in this question of always asking people, does it seem like this to you? Because it's the kind of thing that, doomsday people would say. I'm not, it's like, it's like, I'm not so totally concerned that I'm just a crazy doomsday guy, but I have to be a bit concerned with it. And so then I tend to ask this question to people. So.
Do you have any desire, interest in making either predictions, which is definitely maybe something to be wary of in general, that it's like, if what I believe, if my worldview is true, within 1 year or 5 years, we'll start to see this change that is significant. Anything like that come to mind, or is that kind of an impossible task?
No, it's a great question. And one comes to mind. It's not maybe as sort of, let's say, formulaic or objective as your example, but I would say that if this is roughly correct, we'll see things get more, it will become more and more difficult to make sense of what's going to happen. Now, that would be a prediction you could make about the original story that I think we both share, which is the story of technological ascent. So it would fit both of those. But I think what would maybe differentiate them is that if we are going into this liminal space and then we're going to hopefully arrive in some new configuration, I think that let's say the shortening of so if you look ahead in your life and you're trying to predict what you're going to do or what's going to happen in a year, and if either one of these stories is true, either it's just technology accelerating and us getting wiser, or we're going into this liminal space. In either case, this time horizon with which you can reason about will shorten. It won't be a year anymore, it'll be 6 months, and it'll be 2 months. Does that make sense so far?
That an individual right now can reasonably have a 5-year plan. Maybe it would be less reasonable to have a 5-year plan in this brave new world.
Right. And so then I would say what would differentiate the two, part of it is that if we're going into a liminal space, it's going to foreshorten a lot faster than people expect. For example, coronavirus fucked up all these plans. And I think the default assumption is we're going to go back to normal and then we'll be able to reason about what we're doing again. I don't think that will happen. I think it's going to actually it's going to get worse and worse and worse faster than anybody can predict unless they have this kind of story in their head, assuming the story is true. So that's one prediction. I feel like I had another one in my head, but what do you think about that one so far?
Well, let me just a question. Do you think that corona level events will be happening more frequently, something that destabilizing of our society?
Yes, because I think we live in such our systems are so interconnected that I think we'll look back and see this as the first domino, and maybe it's a big domino and then a couple of small dominoes, but I think, the race riots in the States are insane. And I have a hunch that it's connected, like not connected, but caused. There's a very real sense, and I'm not in the States, so I have to be wary of this sort of idea too. But from what I hear, it's like Corona happened, blah, 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 and then the race riots. And I don't know what all those dots are, but it feels to me like there is a connection there. There's some causal relationship. And so I guess back to predictions, I would predict we're going to see further things breaking down that we didn't expect to break down. We didn't expect race riots. And fuck, how quickly that developed? That was like, at least on my radar, and of course, again, I'm not in the States, so I hear about it. On my radar, it was like, okay, at time 0, I had no idea that there were race riots. And then let's say 2 or 3 weeks later, it was like, oh my God, it's a big fucking deal. What was it like for you? Let me just ask, like, how has this
Yeah. It
evolved? Yeah.
completely absorbed. Actually, I mean, it really is on the same level of Corona, at least for the United States. But actually, there's protests going on in Australia. There's protests going on in the UK where the police don't have guns. There's this is worldwide, maybe one of the most popular civil issues internationally ever, and that might have Corona might have paved the way for that. I mean, a lot of people are talking about how this is the first sort of shared history we all have. This was everyone had to be worried about Corona, and now you have just a few months later this other event, which we've had race riots in the past, right? We could probably both name several um, um, people that were killed that, you know, people would argue was they were killed because of their race, or at least that was a major contributing factor indicating like a cesspool of simmering racism. Um, but something about this one somehow feels more um, absorbing of my attention for sure, you know, as far as an individual node in the system. And there's interplay between the two events, right? So you have people are protesting at a time when it seems like the worst time to protest for non-political reasons, you know, before this reason that we have a virus that if it spreads will kill a lot of people, you know, especially maybe not yourself as a young person protesting, but you'll give it to another young person, they'll give it to their grandpa, you know, asymptomatic, you know, sort of not not a desirable outcome, you know, in a way that it sort of really matters that you're protesting something that needs to be protested, which I actually do think that there's something that there needs to be protested, but I don't have strong convictions. I did when I had like an adamant, you know, I was energized in just by it, you know, shocked by the video of the killing of George Floyd, for instance. And then ever since then, I've been kind of roiling, and more recently, just trying to kind of extract myself because it's so absorbing that I actually can't even focus on other things that I think are more important to me as an individual. Um, Man, you've hit something, yeah, that it's sort of like on the edge of my understanding of how to even deal with this information in a way that I think supports your idea. It's like I can't even think about it rationally or even irrationally. I don't know how to engage with something like this in a way that Corona is like, okay, I think I know that what a pandemic is. I know what I might do as an individual, you know, maybe stop on some supplies and, you know, mitigate my risk by wearing face mask and mitigating others' risk from me, right, in terms of face masks. But the race riots, I have no conception. And oh yeah, I could probably talk about it forever. I mean, it's not useful perhaps to be a white guy. And that's fascinating to me that we've gone back to ideas of what your skin color is more important than your character, your moral character, that what group you belong to, this sort of segregating and judging people based on unalterable characteristics. That's now completely shifted to where that was you know, a very, how would you, I don't know if I want to use right or left or conservative or liberal. Let's say conservative. That's a very conservative value where, you know, in order to preserve our society and keep what we have functioning, because it's important that things are orderly, that we wanted to segregate. And now it seems like the right is saying it's the contents of your character, and the left is saying that no, like because groups are treated differently, it really matters what group you belong to, and there's oppressor classes and victim classes, and to ignore that is racism. But then it's just like a full circle, and that's just one of multiple things. And I don't know, I should just let you react because I said a lot, but I think I see now what you're saying is it's kind of a confusing time, and I'm a little more attuned to that.
Yeah, the race thing is so confusing. We actually just earlier today, so I'm recording this on Saturday, and earlier today we had the third of our weekly meetings, and in the week leading up to it, the consensus emerged. I want to put an asterisk on consensus because I still have some. I'm not sure about that, but the consensus emerged, as far as I could tell, to talk about race, like explicitly bring it up in this call. And unfortunately, I missed the first half of the call. I feel so embarrassed because I am like playing this significant role in the community, and then I mixed up my time zones and I wasn't even there. But what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that it's such a confusing issue, and it actually went really well. What we're trying to do is practice how to have these conversations deeply with deep listening and not fall into the black hole of your ego getting into your discussion about race, which it seems like it always does. It's such a difficult conversation to have. But we felt ready. And then it seemed like even more, the conversation actually went well. And even with a conversation that went well, there's no clear answers. It's just all we could do, and all we were proud to do still, but all we could do was just to come up with more good questions. Like no answers came up. It was like, well, okay, here's a better framing. Here's something to think about. And so I would further predict then that the race riots won't be the last by far. It certainly won't be the last thing that will happen like this. I mean, it's hard to predict what the next thing will be, but I think it's not just when I say our systems are connected, and again, this is an idea that's very much coming from the rebel wisdom, let's say, body of thought. It's not just because there's one level you could conceive of that. What that means is that, our political system reacted to the coronavirus in this way, and that's interconnected with the economy. So the economy reacted in this way, and that's interconnected with class, which is interconnected with race. To some degree, that's what I mean, but I think it's even deeper than that, because it's not just about like let's kind of say like brick and mortar institutions. I think it's also about how we configure ourselves and make sense of the world. And I don't even know if that rings true or if I should explain that more. But my main point I feel like I want to make is that what will break down is not just institutions breaking down. I think it will become harder and harder to even plan out your life. And I think coronavirus and the race riots were two like examples of the class of disruptions I'm seeing. Coronavirus, it kind of quietly threatened death to everybody. And then we went down into this lockdown, which was so unprecedented, not just because everyone did it at once all over the world, but also just the idea of a lockdown. I think most people in our lives, at least if you live in a relatively free, like Western or European country or something, then that's like a totally new thing. And it disrupted everyone's plans. I couldn't leave South Africa when I wanted to. I'm here in South Africa now. And then the race riots, it's different. I don't know. I just feel like I want to compare those two. The race riots are, in a way, you can kind of ignore them, at least right now. But then again, that's how coronavirus started too. You could kind of ignore it, and then suddenly we're in lockdown. So maybe that's not much of a difference. The race riots thing, I think, to me, was a non-issue, at least in my, like, let's say, awareness of the world. And now it's a big fucking issue. Not exactly practically at this moment, because South Africa counterintuitively I think it's just immune to the same kind of energy, because the racial tensions have been here for so long. People aren't about to like riot about it, but who the fuck knows also. And so anyway, I just think we'll see more like that. And when I say like that, that's hard to say, because it's like coronavirus and race riots, in some sense, superficially, they're completely different. And yet they're these things that came out of nowhere. The whole world is experiencing them, and you can blow it off for a while. But at least in the case of coronavirus, suddenly it like slammed itself into everybody's life, and now you can't leave your house. So I guess another prediction you could make is that the race riots if it's of the same class, could escalate to the point where it's actually impacting people day to day. I don't know.
Certainly in certain places of the country, in the United States, it really is.
Mhm.
Minneapolis, I'm
Yeah.
sure, like Seattle. Um, it almost seems easy to predict that it'll get worse before it gets better. I mean,
Mm.
we had the 2008 financial crash. We said that institutions are too big to fail. We poured trillions of dollars into those institutions, so they got even bigger. So they really can't fail this time. We have something called a national debt that seems to get larger and larger and larger, where the interest rate on $23 trillion is what, 500 billion, but it's debt to ourselves, which I don't really know what that means, but it, you know, it sometimes feels like people forget that life has a tragic element to it, and
Mm.
we haven't exactly figured out how to contend with reality as we find it. And we can do things that work pretty well, but eventually, to the extent that those things disagree with what reality is, reality will win. Like, it'll break those things before those things break reality. And so as far as a third black swan event, what about an economic meltdown, right? You have pandemic, which doesn't seem to go away. You have people smashing up businesses. Well, that's not really so much it, but sort of distrusting our highest ideals, and like destroying our history, toppling statues of George Washington for being a slave owner, probably an awful one,
Mm.
and willing to disregard the good things about the culture, the way in which we've nearly eradicated poverty or reduced it from 90% of the world to 10% of the world, how we've drastically reduced infant mortality, and how just about everyone is much wealthier than they were in ways that matter materially.
Mhm.
Or you could always argue that they don't, because people seem to be more depressed now, and it doesn't actually,
Well, you
increasing
did.
material wealth doesn't actually seem to reduce how depressed people are. In fact, they're
You
more
did. You
depressed. So
you used the word
that's
materially, actually, which is interesting. So you said you said that these things have increased our wealth materially, and you phrased it, or you stressed that word like a positive, like cold hard facts, guys. It increased, but
yeah.
then but even within that word is like the hint of then what you
Yeah.
started to say, which is
And
um,
that's definitely coming from Jung, where
right.
you actually can have too much material progress. This very beautiful thing of having a child not die, in the first 2 years of their life from starvation, paradoxically means more people commit suicide. It's a
Right.
crazy idea. Like, how can that be true? You sort of rationally have to reject it. Um, Maybe not. Maybe you can like zoom further out and can see a larger system. But so it seems like perhaps there's some kind of economic meltdown, and when people don't have um, food, when they don't have that sort of economic stability, they are stupider, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a controversial thing to say, but I think I've seen ideas that the more money you have, the better you can think clearly. And so if you're stuck in poverty, you can't even, for some reason, your brain works against you. It's so stressed out, it can't think clearly, and I think there have been studies, I can't quite remember the nature of them, but that sort of indicate that the same person, when they have more or less money, can actually have different results on an IQ test.
Sure. Well,
And
that could touch on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I mean, if most of your waking hours are focused on like finding some food to eat, and that's the only concern, you're never reaching those upper levels. And as far as an IQ test, I could totally see like if you spend, let's say, a year totally focused on just finding food versus a year focused on finding a good job, for example, or even better, finding a meaningful pursuit, that would be these levels of Maslow's hierarchy. Um, even if you had the same caloric intake, it's like I wouldn't be surprised to find that the first of those examples would score lower on an IQ test, because you're not training your brain in, yeah, because I would say it's not so much that if you are struggling with that, you get stupider, but I would say you are forced to be oriented towards solving problems that are not high level. You know, that's all you have to find something. You can't, think about how to find the angle between two lines, or some other theoretical pursuit, or even, God forbid, how to find meaning in your life. Oh, fuck me. Fuck. Why has this happened? Why has this happened? Oh, shit. Tim got a blue screen. He'll be back in a moment. Yeah, so a bit of a technical issue there. Tim got a blue screen and then came back and said he should never have built his own computer. So
Yeah, that was a terrible mistake. It's like, anyways, let's move on. I'm
Okay.
definitely embarrassed of my
Yeah.
engineering skills. I'm a professional. Well, I'm an engineer. That's my trade. So it's not good to build computers that don't work. But
Oh, yeah. Well, so yeah, and unfortunately, when you hit that kind of an interruption, it really, especially when you're in like a flowy conversation, it's just like, and then it stops. I mean, for me, people will probably see on the recording I'm talking, and then I notice you're either really intently focusing because you're just not moving, or you're just gone. And then anyway, yeah, the problem there is that then it's really hard to recover what we were talking about. The last thing I remember was just I mentioned that and actually this is interesting because it could maybe unify the two stories we've been comparing. On one hand, there's like the story of, well, I'm reading this book called The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. Don't know how I feel about it quite yet, but one of his terms is the story of ascent. And it's this idea that technology and man will continue to ascend in an accelerating thing. So that's the one story. And then the other, the alternative I've been sort of putting here is we're entering a liminal zone where shit's going to be really confusing, and it'll be like the abyss of the hero's journey, and then we'll come out to something else. And so this, when you were speaking, you said something about, we're improving materially, and that's, I think, that's exactly it. Like, I think if people don't recognize that we've been improving materially, that's ridiculous. And I've thought that for, I don't know, I want to say 2 or 3 years now. But now I have a more nuanced thing, especially after reading Jung, where there's more than material. Like that more matters than just what is material. And so to say that we've been getting material wealth and to imply that that's all we need, the problem is it leaves out like sanity. It leaves out finding meaning in your life. It leaves out the statistics of suicide, as you mentioned. Oh, your video cut out. I think you're back though. So the way Jung closes his book is to say the rational mind has lost touch with, well, I think he really more specifically says the modern mind has lost touch with sort of numinous symbols and being able to deal with things that don't immediately make sense, and to accept things that don't fit into strict rationality. And I guess I'm just putting this together now. That's how I see the story of ascent, let's say maybe collapsing into a liminal space and reconfiguring to something else, because we're not taking seriously the things we don't understand, and the things that are important, are the things that we can't reason directly about. And that he definitely frames that as a problem. I don't really have much of a conclusion, so I'll just end with his sort of conclusion, which is at the end of this first section of A Man and His Symbols, which was something like, he sort of left that hanging as a problem, and then he followed it by saying individuals can look to symbolism and their own dreams as a he almost says as a response, and I don't remember his exact words. Do you want to add anything? Do you think I've represented that well enough?
Yeah, he sets up this world that's has contradictions that will be explosive if not resolved, and then he says almost tamely but significantly, dreams are important, pay attention to the symbols that your dreams generate. And but he doesn't say how that will help you resolve the issues. He probably
Right.
can't, right?
Right.
But that's important, and it's irrational, right? It's certainly not a rational thing to say, okay, you have nanotechnology and people might be able to create
And
synthetic
AI and
pandemics,
all
but
this shit. Yeah.
listen to your dreams. This will
Yeah.
resolve that issue, bad, evil actors on the world stage.
The scientific mind balks. Goes, what? Come on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You get out of here.
Get out of here. Well,
Uh,
I
and
would
and
love.
let me just
No, finish,
I
please.
he says that we hate it. We hate those things, and I think that's the
The
appropriate
things we don't
word. It's like,
understand.
yeah, we've gone to hating the superstitious. We've gone to hating our dreams, perhaps, and then that's an even deeper thing than seeing them as kind of silly. And I think that is true, and certainly it feels true up until this point. Is you pay attention to how you feel about what you don't know. Either you don't even realize your mind protects you from not knowing it, or you sometimes hate it.
Mm-hmm.
And that feels like an important point to make.
Yeah.
So I made it.
Exactly. And that's just it. The thing is, it feels important, the point he makes at the end. And he doesn't really say it's a solution, but he implies it by the ordering. I would
Yeah.
actually love to share the dream I had a month ago. So this is a tradition Tim and I had on the podcast. Near the end of the podcast, we each share a dream, and then we gave it a grade at the end, and then just kind of talked about the symbolism in it, and it was really helpful. So, and this dream, interesting story behind it. So because I was recording this podcast with Tim, I got in the habit of starting to, if I had a dream, I'd wake up and just record it on my phone, and then with the intent of transcribing it later and then speaking it on the podcast. But this was so now a week ago, I actually found a dream in my phone that I didn't remember recording. It was extremely eerie. I had used my recorder for something else, and I saw an entry called "Coffin Tomb Spark," and I was like, "The fuck is that?" And I kind of immediately guessed, "Oh, this must be a dream I had." But I listened to it, and I might even upload the audio and include it in the show notes, just because the way I'm even speaking is really eerie. I mean, it's clearly me, but I don't remember speaking that way. I'm oddly emotional in parts. Anyway, so I'll include the audio. People can listen to it. But yeah, unless you have any thoughts, I'd love to share that now, Tim.
No, by all means. Yeah, I think that's let's get into it as sort of a kind of a concluding part of this recording.
Sure. Okay, so I'm walking through the woods, and I am tracking some enemies. And I know that I have a friend or ally ahead of me, and I need to signal to this friend or ally. So I grab 2 fistfuls of dry reeds, and I light them on fire. I don't remember how, but I light them on fire, and then I start waving them like an air traffic controller does at a airplane station. Sort of, I'm just kind of making these signals with these flaming reeds. And I'm signaling go left. That's what I'm trying to signal, or that the enemy's going left, something about left. And then I see, like, on a distance, and this is at night, by the way, I see in the distance on a hill up somewhere, a tiny spark, and I know it's my colleague signaling back to me in a similar way. And he's signaling down, indicating that I understand. He's indicating that I should go down. So I go down into this tomb, and as I go down, someone is with me now. As dreams do now, someone is just kind of with me, someone I know, and we go and we find these 2. They're like lockers, but they're clearly also sarcophaguses. So there could be, it's another more tomb, symbolism there. We open one and there's nothing inside. And then I notice my phone battery is about to die, which I'm using as a flashlight. And I say, hey, we gotta leave. My phone battery is about to die. Are you done? And we leave without opening the other, without checking the other locker or the other sarcophagus, whatever you'd like to call it. As we leave, when we go up the stairs, there's like you know how the mummies in movies will have like a big stone slat on top of the sarcophagus, right? And usually if you're gonna rob it, you would need to pull that back. So that's on top of the stairs we're gonna go up to get out. And so the person who's with me goes up and starts to push it, and they get grabbed from the top and pulled out. And I understand the enemy has taken them. And I understand that I must now remain silent and I have to continue alone. And so I retreat backwards into the tomb. And in the audio recording, I say this, and I have this really eerie, it's eerie to me anyway, I have this really deep breath as if I'm myself about to go into this tomb, and I assume I just go back to sleep. So that's the dream. I'd love to talk about the symbolism I see in it, but how does that land for you at first, Tim?
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's definitely, I think that's your first A+ dream. And there's some amazing elements. Yeah, I mean, you have an enemy and you're signaling that they're going left. That almost sounds like left politically, left liberally.
Interesting, yeah.
I think the directions may not be arbitrary. They might be, but that's just something that I can help thinking. Then you have to go down, and you're talking about how, the situation will get worse before it gets better. You sort of intentionally go down into the tomb. And Jordan Peterson talks about going to rescue your father. There's something about this sort of the way you talk about sarcophagus as, I think, having these kind of gods on the sarcophagus, right? And then the mummies on the inside, but there's something culturally significant there. And then you open an empty coffin, which is actually not what I would expect. You don't find the tool you need to slay the monster. There's an unopened one, though. Maybe you went down to the depths and didn't find it, came up too early, but you're forced to go back down again because the enemy is still just as powerful, and you need to face the dark and be with the dead. Or there's so much there. It's a beautiful dream. What have you had time to think of what symbols you see and how you would interpret it?
Yeah, well, I mean, ever since we started really sharing and talking about our dreams on the podcast, I occasionally one will come in, it just sticks with me. And I have no choice but to like handle it and massage it and draw out what I can. And the big thing that stands out for me now is the idea of death and rebirth. Everything you said lined up as well, although I didn't quite come to those conclusions, although I think they're also equally, let's say, valid hypotheses. They feel and I don't mean that just in my head, I mean they feel like they could have resonance too. But the big thing that stuck out to me was that there's this enemy I'm tracking, this threat, and that I have to go into the tomb, and then as I go out, there's a loss of my friend, my comrade has lost, and I need to go back down into the tomb. And I've been wrestling with my cryptocurrency projects. In some ways I'm really sticking my neck out for what I believe needs to be built, even though it might piss off, like governments and shit like that. I mean, if it really takes off, that's the level of ire I could be facing for having started it. And so that naturally leads to like, well, do I want to risk my freedom and life for this? And the answer has tended to come out yes. And I think this dream is me just working through a part of that, because I have thought not so symbolically about like, what if this does result in my imprisonment or death? Would I be okay with that? And I think this dream speaks to, let's say, the reality of my predicament. That is the choice. I mean, I don't know to what extent I'm actually facing those risks. That's hard to really say with any certainty, but I do know that I have to consider those risks, and they're real considerations, And I think it demonstrates like a certain comfort with the idea of like, um, comfort with, yeah, that risk, the risk of dying, although maybe more in the metaphorical sense, even sacrifice, and and something about going back into the tomb. I think it's not just about being okay with a big sacrifice. I think it's also how I've shifted my thoughts on death. About, I hesitate to say I believe in rebirth. I I certainly don't believe in a, let's say, like a scientific truth of rebirth. I don't believe that my soul, I don't believe there's a scientific truth to like, oh, when I die, I'm going to be reborn in the next baby that pops out. I don't really believe in that. But in a more metaphorical sense, I'm becoming more open to the idea. You know, let's say I do this and it gets big, and then I'm imprisoned or killed or never heard from again. I'm becoming comfortable with the idea that that really would just mean that, okay, my experience would end, but it wouldn't be, it's not the worst end. It's not an ultimate end, if that makes sense. That's kind of what I'm coming around to. And of course, we know that. We know that when we die, the world continues on. But somehow I feel like I've begun to internalize that to the extent that, I will die one day. Um, I don't know. Does that make any sense?
No, but I see what you're saying.
Okay.
It doesn't make sense, but it doesn't mean that there's not something
Uh-huh.
useful there. I haven't really contended with that as much. But in your situation, actually, and depending on who knows you, they might scoff at that. But I actually think that you may actually be in that kind of predicament. And I mean, there's powerful people that don't want you to do the work that you're doing. And
Hypothetical powerful people, just to be clear. There's no one coming after me now, but yes.
right. In theory, I mean, we live in a civilized world to a degree, but it's actually we don't actually know where power lies.
Mm-hmm.
We actually don't know who has the most power. Is it the US president?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a trillionaire you don't know the name of?
Mm-hmm.
Like who knows? But and it's hard to know how they'll deal with your project. But yeah, that does make it seem like James Bondy in a way that probably the world doesn't quite work like that. It seems like we'd kind of be more attuned to the fact that people just disappear.
Yeah. That
seem to be working on cryptocurrencies.
Right.
I don't think that's been the story.
Right.
But yeah, that's fascinating. Like I said, I don't actually think it doesn't make sense to me what you're saying in terms of rebirth and whatnot. But I don't think that's a strong argument against it, or even a reasonable one, just because it doesn't make sense. Yeah. If it makes sense to you in terms of your dream and analyzing it, then it's probably useful.
Right. And that's just a thing that Jung has suggested, is you assume the dream makes sense. You assume there's sense to the dream, and then you go and you kind of look for it, and whatever you come out with is, well, that seems like it's going a bit far, and maybe I don't want to dive into that now, but
you could definitely be wrong. Just something might make sense, but it might still be ill-fitting. It may not be the best interpretation. It's not exactly easy to do this. You might be tempted by the wrong answer. Well, especially if it's at your expense.
Yeah. Let's hear what you got. You got a dream cocked and loaded?
Okay. Yeah, I do. I'll read it here. I'm with my sister. We stumble upon a feast. A man is giving a speech, and we understand that the feast is in honor of a scientist. There are long tables filled with people eating. We decide to join the feast, even if we can't sit together because space is limited. As we hunt for seats, we notice that the seating is assigned. There are names at each place. It occurs to me that everyone feasting donated money to have a seat reserved. This does not deter my sister. She finds a seat and starts eating, but I feel shame and start to leave. And after leaving, I feel stupid. The food looks incredible and there's so much that it can't all be eaten. Still, I am stopped by the embarrassment I would feel if I took a chair only to have someone else show up to claim it. I settle for taking a brownie and walking away with it. I walk with my brownie and sit in a crowded area. I recognize a coworker. A haggard woman enters the area and tells my coworker she tried to request his assistance tomorrow and how thankful she was for what he had done for her. She then said she would give him her last dollar. At this, my coworker holds out a dollar to give her. Strangers around me also hold out money, which she collects gratefully. I notice the person giving her the most looks poor himself. I sit there with my stolen brownie and do not give her anything. That's where my dream ends.
Wow.
Well, I'm clearly the good guy.
Huh.
Sometimes dreams tell you something you don't want to know. They poke fun at you or show you to be the bad guy. And this, I definitely feel, is the case. But anyways, well, how does that all sound?
I'm struck by there's almost a poetic element to the second part. When I say the second part, so like you're at the banquet or the whatever, and then you're in the crowd, because she says she's going to give him her last dollar, and then he returns it. He instead gives her a dollar, and then other people give her dollars. There's almost something about that that's like, wow, that's like almost like you would expect it in some book of ancient stories. It's like an archetypal feel to it, if that makes sense. Something about the way that part of the dream went. So that's just one thing that I noticed and I really enjoyed. And then your place in the dream is interesting as well, because you're dealing with ethics from two different directions. You're dealing with the ethics of, I'm at this banquet and I didn't reserve my seat, so I don't like deserve this food or something like that. And then later I'm assuming the way you told it, it sounds like part of the dream was specifically that you didn't give the woman your brownie or a dollar, I assume. Is that correct?
Right. I stole this thing, didn't pay for it. And then in an opportunity where people are very charitable in a way that makes sense to be charitable, poor people, the poorest person was the most charitable. I have a stolen item of food and won't give any money to this woman.
Yeah, that's just I don't want to say too much about it because I'd rather actually hear what you say, but that's just really interesting. That theme of, it almost feels like it's like two different views of a similar ethical question, which is interesting. And then finally, I just want to point out that similar to one of your other dreams, there's one similar theme where you're worried about like seating and your role to play in a crowd gathering. I remember you had that dream about going to it was like a comedy club, and you were like sitting on a stool, and a lot of your dreams seem to be focused on sort of how to play your role correctly. And that just struck me as similar to what you just said about the seating, the assigned seating.
Yeah.
So tell me, yeah, that's just what struck me, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it now.
I'm definitely a confused man. But what I think I understand from the dream is the banquet early on, the feasting is society, and it actually feels like a materially wealthy place. In fact, it's an honor of a scientist, and I see technology coming from science as the largest driver of what we've accomplished. And sometimes I feel guilty about just my luck in having everything that I have, knowing how much suffering there is. And I almost feel like I can never actually pay back society for the roads, the healthcare, the justice system, just everything that it gives me. I couldn't possibly pay it back. I almost feel like that table is people who have paid for their seat or have earned it somehow, but I feel like I don't earn it. But then I'm still kind of resentful, so I steal. I'm like, well, they've created so much, no one will even notice. So I take a little bit, and sometimes I feel that way is I live below my means So actually society rewards me with money for the value that I give it back with my job as an engineer. And there feels like a contradiction there. I always feel like I'm overpaid, and then I feel like I'm underpaid as well. And but that's, I just want more. And well, I think it's tied in with my work, because I go and I steal that brownie, deciding that I can have that. Like, they won't even notice it gone. And I can participate in this material wealth in some way, even if I can't pay for it, in a way that, like, my sister just decided she's going to enjoy the whole feast and not worry about any embarrassment of being found out. And then I go sit down and notice a coworker, which makes me just think of my job and what I'm doing there, which I tend to have doubts about whether it's the best use of my time, even though I'm compensated well for it. And then it's like revealed to me how deep my greed is, where this woman who is desperate but is a good soul, like, and very grateful to this person and thankful for him, and and how other people treat her well and don't mind sacrificing and making sacrifice themselves, namely in money, to give her, including the poorest person that I saw. And then I decide not to. And I think that was my psyche showing me that I'm not acting the way that I should, because that was not a good look. I wasn't happy with that dream. It wasn't a fun dream to have. And I think specifically with I don't know. I don't actually know exactly what to do, but it feels like the material world, like maybe I'm giving the world materially a lot, but I'm not giving something else in myself that's more important to give. And that feels like I'm heading in the right, that intuition is the best I've had so far. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know if I even have much more to add. I think it sounds all. It sounds right, in as much as it can sound right to me, being not the dreamer. It is interesting, the idea that, or the feeling you have, that the criticism, the self-criticism, has to do more with what you might not be giving that's not material. Is that right?
Yeah,
is that what you said?
It would have been me giving her material things, which is kind of odd.
But
I wouldn't be
you
giving her
seem
a hug.
convinced, though, that it meant the opposite of that. Is that right?
It just felt like I wasn't giving something, and maybe, but that's a good point, that I would by what everyone was giving her, I would be giving her material things as well. In theory.
Right.
I mean, I could have embraced her, I could have hugged her, but that's not really appropriate, probably,
right.
Socially.
Well, it's interesting to me that you would have that thought, even though, let's say, the literal dream didn't necessarily imply that. And this is something I wonder about Jung. I don't want to get too carried away. I want to actually wrap this up pretty quick. But with Jung, it's not clear to me whether Jung would suggest that if you have a feeling about a dream, but you can't reason about why you feel that way, should you believe it or not? I mean, my hunch is that if you have that feeling about it, my hunch is to sort of lean more in that direction, actually.
I don't think I would have felt guilty about it if I didn't steal the brownie. I think I don't have, and maybe, and this is, I think, is slightly part of it. Maybe we should just wrap it up, but I know I've given up something in myself. I no longer feel when I see a homeless person asking for money. I've just decided that I can't solve that problem. And I don't decide to give them money every time. It's not even a difficult choice there.
Yeah.
It doesn't even enter my head as a choice. But it's kind of different when you've just recently gotten this gain from society. You can look at it differently. And I think part of it is my unconscious is prompting me to reevaluate my thinking there, I just still don't think it's rational to give away all my money to all the poor, because they'll hardly be better off and I'll be much worse off. But that doesn't mean that there's not other ways to contend with that,
Yeah.
with that kind of suffering.
Right.
Well, what kind of grade would you give me?
Oh, I think that's A or B. Let me think here. I think A. Yeah, A. Because it's so, as I said, it like has this archetypal feel to it, especially the part about the money and how the poorest guy gave her the most money. It's fascinating. It's like, I'm still not convinced that there is a story writer making dreams, but when you have a dream like that, it makes me doubt it a little bit, because it's like, it's such symbolism like that. It almost, it's hard to imagine it's not crafted by somebody.
Yeah, intentionally. So yeah, it's crazy stuff. It's beautiful stuff as well. Well, shall we end this recording?
Let's end it. Cool. Yeah. So we'll put together some other kind of project, I think. The regular Saturday thing was great. And yeah, so maybe I will write about it. I'll feel like uncomfortable maybe about putting it on this YouTube channel, because I'm still trying to figure out what this channel is for. Anyway, I'll put a link to your site where we host this stuff, and there'll be more info there as we move on. So that'll be a way people can follow if they're interested.
Sounds good.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Later.